that delivers growth, but the entrepreneurs and employees behind the companies. David is an expert in online commerce and retailing through his years of research, investing, and advising experience. While still a professor at Wharton, he was an early investor in leading brands including Bonobos, acquired by Walmart for $310 million, Diapers.com, acquired by Amazon for $545 million, Harry's, Jet.com, acquired by Walmart for $3.3 billion, and Warby Parker, amongst others. David is now president of Idea Farm Ventures, a New York-based venture studio that invests in consumer lifestyle brands. He joins us to discuss what he sees coming next as an investor, what he focuses on now, and in what spaces he sees opportunities. As a New Zealander who has lived and worked overseas for a long time, David will share his thoughts on New Zealand's opportunities to build and scale direct-to-consumer companies, as well as providing some advice to New Zealand entrepreneurs and investors. David, welcome. It's fantastic having you here.
Hey, Stefan, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and with James too, so thank you for that.
Great. Well, let's kick off. Tell us a little bit about your journey to the States. Where did you start, and how did you find, the inspiration to go down the path that you have?
Well, great question, 100%. So starting at the real start, I was actually born in the deep south in New Zealand, and this might be fun for some of our listeners. Lived down the street, what my parents did, from the fellow Burt Munro in the famous Kiwi movie, The World's Fastest Indian. And then my dad changed jobs, moved to Auckland. I got three younger brothers. We all grew up in Auckland, went to Auckland Uni, and was just really fortunate to be at Auckland Uni. There was some very good professors there and kind of a chain of students going through what was then the MCOM program, and they were all wandering off to the United States, and they're all actually really good students. So one went to Wharton, one went to University of Chicago, one went to Northwestern, and then sort of build up to the guy that was one step before me. We used to call him the boy wonder because he was sort of so bright. So this Kiwi guy, Duncan, applied to all the top universities in the United States, Stanford, MIT, Wharton, got accepted to every single one. And I was his office mate, so I was sort of twiddling my thumbs. What am I going to do? I'm 21, I think, at the time. Going to the United States, that could be kind of fun. So he sort of encouraged me, and off the back of the success of the others, I applied, and then wound up at Stanford, I think in large part because the other three were so good, and then Duncan turned down Stanford, and I was like the next guy in the queue. So they thought, well, we better, get one of these Kiwis. So that's what got me to the United States originally, to go to Stanford to study for the PhD at the business school.
Well, Stanford's you go, James.
I was just gonna to put into context, what year is this, Dave? Because going to Stanford, San Francisco, during a tech, revolution.
Well, when I was a student, James, it was in the early 90s. So I was at Stanford from 91 to 95. And another sort of funny Kiwi story, I had a great professor there, Dave Montgomery, and he told me he had this fantastic student, quite a few years before me, but a fantastic student in the MBA program by the name of Hugh Fletcher. And he said this guy was such a good student that he wanted Hugh to go on to the PhD program. He was trying to recruit him. And I guess Hugh had apparently, according to this Professor Dave Montgomery, said, well, I've got to go back to New Zealand. I've got some family business to run. Not realising, of course, it was this massive,
small little family business to run.
Massive.
It's not a big deal.
So, it was good. So early 90s, James, was when I was there as a student.
So that's sort of the early 90s, going to San Francisco, not really probably aware what is about to happen in that city over the course of the next 30 years.
Not at all. And I think sort of two other things. One's more of a personal issue to Stefan's point. One thing I didn't realise going in is there's kind of an expectation if you're in a PhD program is that you go on into academia. If you're in the Stanford MBA program, you could start a company, work for Google, do whatever you want. And of course, you're not compelled to do this, but there's an expectation on the part of the professors in the institution. Boy, you came in, you had a scholarship, there's only a few people. We trained you, we want you to go and teach at NYU. That's the kind of thing. And that didn't really click until I was about halfway through. I was obviously fine with going down that path, but I remember, I had a very sophisticated classmate from India who'd done computer science at MIT, and he was introducing all of us to your point, James, all the early browsers, like there was Mosaic and all this other cool stuff. You could search this thing called the World Wide Web, and some other guy figured out how to hack his email so you could send your advisor an email at 3 a.m. so they'd think you were, analyzing data. So it was fun times.
The beginning of something massive.
Indeed.
And so I guess you continued on from there. You completed your PhD at Stanford, and then you went on into academia for a while. How did that happen?
Yeah, so there was a natural funnel, Stefan. If you're in a PhD program, when you get to sort of 1 year before graduation, so usually around July 4th, the big American holiday, you sort of mail out or email out your resume to a bunch of universities that are hiring or places that you might want to work. And of course now, it's so much more competitive to get those jobs because you'll have someone who's got a PhD in physics. It's like, gee, I could actually teach finance because I know how to do math, and I could get a job as opposed to being a postdoc. Back in the day, it wasn't quite so competitive, but you send out your resume and then you hope that different institutions might want to interview you. So you go to a big conference, the American Marketing Association. My year was actually in San Francisco. And then you'll kind of have meetings on the hour, every hour, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, sometimes Monday. And then hopefully out of that process, some people will then invite you to the campus. Then it's getting pretty serious. You'll get flown out to NYU, for example, and you'll be there a couple of days and you'll meet faculty and you'll present your research. And then hopefully sometime around Thanksgiving, the other big holiday, you might get an email or a phone call where they're putting together an offer to offer you a job. So I was going through that process basically from July through, December. And then I was fortunate, to get some, decent offers come in. And then it was a matter of, okay, where the heck do I, where would I like to go as the next step?
And so you've obviously taken your career in a particular path and explored, which was, I guess, the meat of this conversation was that sort of intersect between the physical and the virtual. And did that at that point inform your decision about the university you work with, or is that something that evolved once you kind of launched further into it?
Yeah, great question. That's something that's really evolved. So, to go back to what James said, when I was a graduate student at Stanford, there was a whole cottage industry in marketing academia, which I was a part of people who did quantitative research using data from effectively supermarkets or retail. So, barcode scanner data. And you could build a demand model that said, Coke drops the price, do people switch in from Pepsi, do they drink more, do they change stores, all the basic sort of demand dynamics of consumer behavior. And then when I was a faculty member at Wharton, the first couple of years I was still doing that, but then this thing called the internet starts rolling along. And what I found fascinating about that is when you're focused on physical retail and physical stores, the good news is you know where your customers are. They're in a very predefined area close to that store. The bad news is the market's relatively limited. And then this e-commerce thing's the converse. The good news is, you sell into the whole US. The bad news is who the heck's ever heard of diapers.com? So I thought just from an intellectual point of view, this is really interesting because now you can have retailing without constraints. And of course, the old saw in retailing, location, where you physically locate determines everything. In this new world, it came to dawn on me, it's not the physical location of where you are because now you're virtual, but the physical location of your customers still matters for how you get uptake because their physical location tells you about who they are, what their preferences are, and also what their constraints are. So there's a funny story. The first guy to ever buy a book, I think on Amazon.com, he was a really avid reader, but he was about 50 miles from the nearest bookstore. So the internet, obviously, to him was a tremendous innovation because now instead of schlepping, 100 miles there and back, he can have the store come to him. So that was a sort of a natural transition from studying consumer behavior and retail and physical environments now into, oh boy, now there's this virtual environment. What's different about it?
Was that journey obvious in terms of the consumer going onto the digital space? Because I guess the trustworthiness of the internet back then, we're just learning how to use it. And I was just watching a Netflix series, Better Call Saul, and it was sort of going flashback in time where this woman was using the internet for the first time, and she just thought it was miraculous that she could get up YouTube videos of cats, let alone going the extra mile of buying things online.
Cats are pretty special.
I mean, cats are pretty special.
I think the funny thing there, James,
what were you
was just going to say, even in 2022, you know, cats are still dominating the internet. But sorry, I'll let you finish your thought, and then I'll jump back in.
No. If I had started a YouTube video with cats, I think I'd be retired on the beach somewhere up in Northland. But because it's been a pretty successful avenue of internet.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the apocryphal fintech companies started with guys, you know, taking photographs of cats and $100 bills. I forget which one it is, but it's one of the ones that's gone on to go public. But no, to answer your question seriously, I think there's sort of two considerations there. One was all the plumbing at the time, so taking payments, doing delivery, having trust, like all of those things were fairly nascent. And if you think about how the internet use for e-commerce evolved across countries, you had countries, say, for example, India, where you'd have cash on delivery because people didn't want to pay or they didn't have credit cards. And so one of the big opportunities early on, and even today, is how do you make things like payment, delivery, trust, return, infrastructure, like building those pipes. So as you might recall, I guess as we all know, you know, Amazon, when it started, really started with books. And the reason you start with books is a book is a very simple product to understand. Whether it's online or offline, it's effectively the same thing. There's nothing tactile about it. There's no shock value. You know, when this shows up, maybe the shirt doesn't fit or the shoes don't fit and so on. And so I think those early companies tended to focus on very, very simple products, James, with what I'd call only really having digital attributes. It's a bit of jargon, but I think it's very helpful. A digital attribute is some product feature that whether I tell you about it online or offline, you're equally happy, you're not confused about it. A non-digital attribute would be, you know, how's the taste of the banana or how ripe is the peach? That's harder to communicate. And that's where a lot of the opportunity is, using technology to get people over the hump around non-digital attributes. And then the second thing, I guess, in a developed market like the US, there was still issues around trust, but probably less pronounced because your Amex will refund you, or there's ways to get around if that didn't happen. But I remember there was kind of a famous and very funny cartoon, you guys might have seen it, in 1993, came out in the New Yorker, and there's this little dog, and he's up on his laptop, you know, banging away on the keys, and he's looking down to his little dog friend, and he says, you know, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And that was kind of that era where, you know, there was anonymity and maybe sort of lack of trust. But as those things were overcome, and in most developed markets they are, it's still really interesting to me that e-commerce penetration, even at the top end, is probably no more than 15 to 20% on average across all consumption categories. You know, maybe it's 80% for contact lenses and, you know, 0.5% for eggs. But this sort of tells you now, with the benefit of hindsight, that the physical world still matters tremendously for commerce.
And so the development of e-commerce, the Amazon example is a really good one, where actually it wasn't because Bezos thought that all the bookshops needed disrupting. It was because the book itself was easy to do e-commerce because there was less, I guess, friction in the transaction, because you order a book, you kind of know what it's going to look like, can't really get damaged in the post, and the value perhaps isn't that high that if it does go wrong, it's not the end of the world, rather than him driving to his local bookstore and think, hey, this is a really bad experience, I can make this better.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a great insight, because if you look at other companies that have been developed, they might have been addressing different issues. So just off the top of my head, you know, say Casper Mattresses, for example, when that was a hot company selling you direct-to-consumer mattresses, the thing that was really attacking is buying a mattress was a bit of an awful buying experience. You know, you're in some showroom somewhere, you're trying to sit on different beds, some guy's trying to upsell you. And so you're exactly right. When it started, there was really nothing wrong with the buying experience. It was more about finding a product that really, at the time, could fit the medium. And maybe for some people, they had a preference of not going into stores. But now I think with the evolution of e-commerce, we've seen companies that have, you know, attacked certain kinds of customers. You mentioned bonobos at the start, Stefan. So, you know, men are really great customers online because they sort of just get into a rut or into a habit, and they're sort of quite loyal. And in fact, even the name bonobos, right? It's named after the bonobos monkey deliberately, because Andy Dunn, the founder of Bonobos, sort of said, you know, men are like monkeys when they shop. You know, Stefan wants to go and get 5 ties, 3 pairs of pants and 2 shirts and be done. And then there are other cases where, you know,
once
the
a year,
internet's
that's
about,
right.
you know, going after a broken category or going after a certain kind of customer.
I mean,
a
you just
revolution.
described me in the Dollar Shave Club is. I mean, I think I've subscribed to that 4 years ago, and I've never. Why would you cancel it? It does the same thing as it says at the box as it did at the start, and it's easy and it arrives and.
You've used the word revolution and consumer behaviour and business models. Would you mind expanding on why you think it amounts to that? I mean, at one level, it is obvious, but there are dimensions to it, I think, that are not so obvious.
So I think the reason why I would use that term is that, particularly in the space that I'm in, which is consumer investing, consumer and retail, it's very, very accessible to everybody. It's a very democratizing form of entrepreneurship, and that you see that every day as an investor. And what do I mean by that? So, of course, you've got people who are tech geniuses, right, like Elon Musk, people who are incredible coders, people who can build phenomenal technology and things like that. And that takes real, very, very special expertise. And I'm not downplaying, but I'm rather sort of emphasizing the positive of consumer entrepreneurship, just to the point that was made by James. Michael Dubin had no real experience in razors. He's the founder of Dollar Shave Club. He's just happened to be a very funny guy who was kind of annoyed at the fact that his razors were too expensive. And so all the, what you call enabling factors, so a payment mechanism, a contract manufacturer, someone to build a website, all of those things are in place. So if you just happen to be a person anywhere in the world, New Zealand, LA, New York, wherever, and you have something that sort of dissatisfies you, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for you, it doesn't work properly, you now have an ability to address that problem in a way that you couldn't do it before. And so that's why I think it's a real revolution. And I love an old quote, since we're in New Zealand. Edmund Hillary, when he and Tenzing Norgay, ascended Mount Everest, they were sort of lauded by the press and the contemporaries. Boy, you guys are amazing. And what he says, well, actually, you don't have to be an extraordinary person, to do an extraordinary thing. You just have to be an ordinary person who's sufficiently motivated. And so Michael Dubin, built $1 billion company in 4 years because he was an ordinary guy, but he was very motivated by the opportunity and the pain point.
How do you think consumers have changed in the process? I mean, at one level, I'm looking at my shopping habits, and they're not that great, but my family's is, and we buy so much online now, and to the groceries, an example, but almost everything turns up at the doorstep, and I don't know to what extent this is a reflection of consumers at large, but how do you think it's sort of embedding itself in the community, this shift to the virtual?
So I think there's really two things there. The first thing, I think consumers really are fundamentally looking for products and services that are really better. And by that I mean better for you, better for the planet kinds of things. So you're having conversations around now, things like carbon negative rather than even carbon neutral, or, the food that you eat has different kind of sustenance or macro profile. So I think there's definitely a seeking out, or a company here in Los Angeles called Bite, B-I-T-E. It's effectively like a little Altoid pill as toothpaste. And why is that? Because you take the plastic out of the ocean and the plastic tubing and the chemicals. So I think there's sort of a groundswell of what I would call the psychographic of the millennial or the Gen Z consumer, which is wanting sort of better stuff. And that's affecting us. I'm obviously not a millennial, I'm a Gen Z. And then the second part of that, as Gen Z, I'm a Gen X. I'm going in the wrong direction with the alphabet today. And then the second thing that you alluded to,
I thought maybe San Francisco is making you feel younger.
Well,
it's a hard life in America.
Exactly. Being here in California, there's probably some doctor around the corner who can, could be some sort of a surgery to, take a few years off. But the other thing that you alluded to, Stefan, that's really important too, is the mechanisms through which people are willing to buy has also changed. People buy stuff on Instagram, people buy stuff through text message, people are, e-commerce, people buy click and collect, buy online, pick up in store. So you've got these two tracks going at once, where there's a seeking out of stuff that's better, and at the same time are willing to sort of transact through multiple sort of sources or multiple channels or medium, and those two things are happening in parallel.
Yeah. You mentioned in a talk we saw about bonding, not branding, and that I guess, manufacturers, producers, and I guess people, marketeers, branding specialists, should think about it in that way. Do you want to expand on what that means and why that's so important and how that sort of fits in with the change in dynamics?
Yes, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I sort of first stumbled into this idea probably 4 or 5 years ago, where I was trying to reflect back and think about companies that succeeded, what have they done well in terms of building a brand? And, brand is obviously very important. There's lists around the world, the value of the Apple brand just on its own is worth, hundreds of millions of dollars, meaning that if you put that logo on a product, customers would ascribe value to it. So we know that brand is really critical. But what I started to think about, again, to the point of this new way of consuming products and the new products and services coming out, is there was a nuance that I think is better captured by what are called bonding. So what's the definition of bonding? So bonding is a close relationship that develops as a result of shared experiences. And brands that are successful now really have these sort of 3 pillars to them. First of all, they work, but they also make people feel good, and they allow consumers to show other people to whom they're socially connected that they're making good decisions. So, people will post up, I'm wearing Allbirds shoes because, they're good for the planet. And then second and third, it refers to being sort of authentic and personable with your customers, sort of being relatable almost in a very human way. And the third part of that bonding piece is, successful companies now will have communities that they engage with and communities that create content, so sort of scalable, engaged communities. So the bond is all about something that has emotional resonance and that has community, and it's very different from a top-down approach. If you think of traditional advertising, since James mentioned shaving, if you think about Gillette, amazing brand, amazing product, but built top down from telling you Gillette's the best a man can get and using traditional channels. Michael Dubin, Dollar Shave Club is organic, bottom up, relating to this particular guy who's the founder. So that's the nuance of difference that I think really in 2022 and beyond, there needs to be this really relatable, almost in a person-to-person sense of brands that are going to succeed.
David, why do you think a lot of the successes of these companies like Dollar Shave Club, a lot of the ones that you've been involved in, and many others, are all coming through the US, and specifically even some of those top universities, Stanford being an amazing, creator of these people that think about life and how we consume and how we relate to each other in different ways. Is it the education system? Is it just you just happen to have a lot of smart people in a very small proximity? Is it the culture of the US? And why is it that other countries aren't sort of being the thought leaders in a lot of this? And that's a generalization. Some great stuff coming out of the UK and Australia and New Zealand, but just not to the same extent that you must see on a day-to-day basis when you're in the US. And do you know why that is?
Well, I think it's a great question, and 100%, you're absolutely right. There's phenomenal, commercial entities, companies built across the world in all different kinds of countries and cultures. But if we created some sort of index or metric, I think we'd be right that the US sort of over-indexes on the creativity and entrepreneurship and, of course, big outcomes for investors. And I think there's really 2 things driving that. One is very much a cultural phenomenon. So, you would know, traveling here a lot too, James, on a superficial level, New Zealand and the US are very, very similar. We probably watch similar kinds of content, listen to similar music. We obviously all speak English. But beyond that surface similarity, there's a real difference, I think, in terms of mindset, whether it's consumers or whether it's entrepreneurs and investors. And people talk about this a lot, but, sort of the risk tolerance and the willingness to fail. And actually, if you almost haven't been successful if you haven't at least failed a few times first. So I think that risk-taking, and that's supported by the culture, but it's also supported by the investing community. And then the second thing I think that you have a lot here is that people who are successful, rather than being sort of reviled or torn down or looked down upon, of course, there's always a little bit of that. Generally it's sort of held up as kind of icons in the culture, and whether that's broadly across the United States or within a more isolated ecosystem, it occurs on both levels. So, the fact that in 2010, a bunch of guys at Wharton at the business school started Warby Parker, they then became sort of folk heroes for the woman who showed up in 2015 and said, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'll do it in this category. So you've got this sort of virtuous cycle of, success wanting to be emulated by the next generation and the broader culture being supportive of that. And, having lived here for a long time, and we spoke before the podcast, still not holding the passport. I better get the American passport at some point. I think it's no coincidence that the only country that you ever hear prefixed by the word dream is the American dream. And whether or not that's empirically true for everybody, it's certainly a belief that most people hold, certainly the immigrant community that comes here. So, a lot of problems, obviously, in the United States, but I think that sort of notion, encapsulated in the American dream is still available and still true for many people.
When you come home, I'm assuming you still call New Zealand home. You've still got the accent, so you must do. Do you see a difference or feel a difference in terms? Because I think you're right. When I travel to the US, that the celebration of success is massive. And like you say, some people could take that as superficial, but actually, I think it's just an ingrained culture. In New Zealand, we've got a little bit more conservatism around success. And do you feel that when you come home, when you're talking to businesses and entrepreneurs when you're in New Zealand?
I think, James, generationally, I see younger people who are more going out and taking hold of success and sort of trying to do things entrepreneurially. So, I think about myself as an AXA who was at, Auckland University a few decades ago, and the young people I meet now, whether they're working for sort of iconic New Zealand companies like Azuru, which is a world-beating kind of entity, or doing their own entrepreneurial things, I think they're hungrier and more embracing of that journey, success or failure, than it was true for, in my case, you do a BCom and you go and work for one of the big four accounting firms or something of that nature. So I do see that spirit is much more alive than it was. And then I think secondly, the government's obviously doing a lot to help us too. New Zealand's having a bit of a moment, and people are looking to New Zealand as a place to either be domiciled, and there's, we could probably name off a bunch of people who've come from, say, San Francisco technology scene, or people with, real deep expertise and investors, are now sort of plugging into New Zealand. So you've got infrastructure support that probably wasn't there 20 years ago. Still has some distance to travel, I think, but both of those factors are making the country more US-like than it was certainly when I was a student.
Are you you mentioned Zero? Are there other Kiwi stories that sort of you're really proud of?
Yeah,
and that you kind of hold up.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's some fantastic stories in New Zealand, not directly in my space, but if you think about sort of rockets, robotics, software, technology, those kind of companies that have gone on to sort of global success. In my own space of consumer and retail, you think about a company like Allbirds, I've called, stocks off a little bit, but still done something really impressive. You think about Ethtique in the skincare space, being built out of Christchurch, an amazing company. You think about Fix and Fog, peanut butter that's probably outselling, 2-to-1, whatever the next best is here, Justin's. A company that I just saw very recently that I think was just awesome. Again, just really anchoring to consumer companies that I know a little bit about and admire in New Zealand is a company called WoolAid. What Lou's doing is really impressive in the sense about 50 billion plastic Band-Aids are going into the environment every year. They're never going to biodegrade. And, being a good Kiwi, she's come up with a merino wool Band-Aid or a plaster that biodegrades in a few months and also has better properties in terms of healing. So I think across the board, you're seeing some real innovation coming out of New Zealand.
Yeah, we it's a theme that because I guess we get through this podcast we get to talk with a range of people, and that sort of encouraging Kiwis to go out and get on with it and do it as something that is sort of a lot of people who have been abroad really want to be a part of, and it's a funny cultural thing. I wonder if the internet has showcased the American mindset more to younger people, and that's, is what's encouraging them.
Yeah, I'm sure that certainly has been a factor too, right? Because everything's so global, everybody's so connected, and so, you might be a Kiwi entrepreneur and say, oh gosh, there was some, somebody at Cosmetics, or take a pick of company Drunk Elephant, had a massive outcome for $1 billion, and we've got some special ingredients in New Zealand, or I've got a way of thinking about skincare that I could do that just as well. And so I think people are just more on top of what the trends are, but also what the opportunities are, and also, you can look to emulate success that you're seeing across the globe. So for sure. And I think, just to layer in a very sort of Kiwi angle to it, I think, New Zealanders are just really good at stuff. We're really good at a lot of different things. We often don't like to talk about being good at different things, but the DNA from our education system, from where we are geographically to, excellence that we've achieved in a number of different domains, the DNA is there to create these things. And what we're building up now is I think the infrastructure to help us do that from an investing point of view, and other things that are needed. But also just I think, the cultural shift that's saying, hey, this is actually really cool to do. Of course it's cool to, if you're a young guy in New Zealand, be an All Black and, play fullback and, win the World Cup. That's awesome. But isn't it also cool to come up with some amazing product that people all around the world are using, that's better for them, that's better for the environment? That's also amazing too. So I think in the US, back to James's earlier point, someone like a Musk or a Bezos or an Oprah or Beyonce, they've kind of achieved a cultural status that's similar to what you would have for, LeBron James, or an athlete or a musician or a culture maker. But I think in New Zealand, we haven't really embraced typically our entrepreneurs on the same level that we would embrace our culture makers and our athletes. And I think that's also changing.
You're now focused more on Idea Farm Ventures, and as would you talk us through what it does and how you kind of got into that?
100%. So I'll start with the getting in. So through being a professor, I actually just got into this journey of helping students with ideas around companies, and then obviously not when they were students, but then they go on and graduate, and then they might pick up the phone and say, oh, we're raising capital for, company X, would you like to participate? So, oh, why not? So over a period of about, going back about 12, 13 years now, I just invested in a whole bunch of companies, from some of them you mentioned, Diapers.com, Jet.com, Harry's, Warby, Bonobos, Cotopaxi, a whole raft of these things. And I started to realize, this is actually kind of fun. And I had a few close friends who'd gone into the investor space. One is a quant hedge fund guy who was a professor, and another guy I used to play rugby with who was an MBA, who was doing sort of distressed assets, also doing a hedge fund. And wow, this could be kind of interesting. And I'd started to invest personally in funds myself. And so in 2015, I went to New York, and I was working just part-time as a venture fellow at a fund and learning the ropes. And my business partner at Idea Farm, he came from the banking world, from Lazard, focused on sort of M&A in the consumer space. And we've been friends for a long time, and we just, over a period of years, sort of put our heads together and said, we should set up an entity to continue our investing journey, but to do it on a larger scale, because he had been investing personally in service-based businesses, mainly in the Middle East. He's originally from Turkey, and I'd been investing in all these product companies. And we said, gee, what if we put together a vehicle, the vehicle's Idea Farm, to continue this and to build a team. And that's what we've been doing for the last 5 years. But I guess the personal journey for me started, considerably longer before that.
And so how do you originate the opportunities? Is it still through historical, university connections, or are you out there, scouring the internet and other channels to find things?
It's honestly actually more of the latter. Some of the former still happens organically, just because I'm quite, sort of still deep in the academic community. But what we say at Idea Farm, our sort of mantra with the team is that we seek, we don't screen. And what that means is, we're actually quite academic in the way we think about things, hopefully academic in the good sense, not in the pejorative sense, but we'll have a particular vertical that we'll look at. So say fix and fog I mentioned earlier. So we have a vertical we call authenticity of eating. And what does that mean? That means better for you, better for the planet, food and bev, and there could be a number of things under that around, alternative proteins or flavors or, a bunch of stuff. And then what we'll do is we'll sort of, as a team, say, okay, we think there's a big opportunity in, alternative waters or nut butters or whatever it is. And then we'll look out to see if we can find companies who are doing that. And then if we can, we'll sort of chase down the founder and see if they're interested, if there's an opportunity to invest. And that opportunity is always in terms of a discussion around how can Idea Farm actually help, because maybe it'll dry up a little bit, but capital's been really plentiful, sort of money is money. So that's how we do it, Stefan. Of course, we also have our own network, whether it's academics or branding agencies, design companies, people that we've built long-term relationships with that know what we're looking for, that will funnel us stuff. So there is a little bit of that, but we're not really set up to have, very wide funnel that we then sort of screen those opportunities and say, hey, it looks like we'd like to invest in James, but not John. We've tried to invert that model a little bit.
So are you getting your hands dirty, David, in these businesses and getting on the board and helping them with their strategy, or is it like the idea, investing in the people and letting them go for it and watching from a distance?
Yeah, it's absolutely the former, getting your hands dirty and getting involved. Obviously, there's a correlation between the check size and sort of how involved we are, but the initial conversation with the founder will be, okay, well, what keeps you up at night? Where do you really need help? And if they tell us, for example, we're a bit concerned about, maybe the brand is not where it is, we'll say, okay, we could bring in an agency to do that, or we could do things internally as a team. And this was really born out of my days at the university. So, with the Warby guys, the big issue was if you're going to sell glasses online and you know that Luxottica is making these things for $20 in China and selling them for $300, where should you be priced? And so I sort of help the guys sit down and do something called a conjoint study to try and be more analytical around what that number should be. So it could be everything from that to issues around branding to running experiments or analyzing data. It's really a whole raft of things. But yeah, we're very much, I would say, almost like a private equity approach to early stage, where we are hands-on and we're doing a bunch of stuff with the founders, maybe helping them unlock retail, helping them think about omni-channel. So really a raft of things.
It sounds, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you put a lot of emphasis on the product rather than or maybe as much as the person. Some investors we speak with, founders first, and if they're passionate and there's an energy and an intensity and conviction there that they buy into, then it almost doesn't matter what they're doing. Whereas it sounds to me like you kind of go the other way and you say, well, look, we found a niche or a vertical that you think has legs, and we'll find the people that serve that the best.
It's a very interesting way to think about it. I mean, I think it's more of a balance between the two, but I totally agree. If you're in pure tech, you just sort of find the genius who, like, for example, I'll give a tangible example, because I met him actually in New Zealand, speaking at a conference. I forget the fellow's last name, but like every other guy you meet, his first name's David. But he's the founder of a company called Masterclass.
David Bello.
Really engaging guy, and he came out of Stanford, I think, with a technology background. Anyway, he was telling the story of...
Sorry, what was he the founder of, David?
Oh, sorry, James. Masterclass, the online education.
Masterclass.
So it's kind of like Netflix meets education in the sense that you could take a class from Steph Curry on how to shoot a three-pointer, take a class from Malcolm Gladwell on how to write a book. So it's kind of tastemakers, influences, people with expertise, and very, very high production value at Masterclass. And what David said was that he just had somebody in his network who literally gave him $500,000 and said, do whatever you want, before he even had an idea. And I think there's absolutely great backable companies in that space. In our space, because the exit distribution, so it all kind of fits together if you think this, the exit distribution for a consumer company is going to be probably 100 to 500 million, let's say. You're not going to have a $50 billion peanut butter company or a $50 billion eyewear company. I mean, the range is much smaller, and so what that says is, efficient capitalization, not too many rounds of financing. It's got to be a great product that's differentiated, built with a great brand, and yeah, of course, the founder is really, really important. Can that founder attract capital, attract a great team? Do they have a vision to build and everything else? But there's probably a little bit less, and not to denigrate the founders, a little bit less of that, because the building blocks for consumer are a little clearer. Is the product differentiated? How is the brand built? What's the pricing strategy? So there are things that you can control a little bit that are not necessarily going to guarantee success, but are going to reduce the loss ratios and the odds of failure in a way that's a little bit different to the tech dynamic. So a little bit of a long answer, but hopefully that leans into why, of course, founders still is important, but all this other stuff becomes really important as well.
It's probably a good segue into the market at the moment, David, because, on the listed markets, which is where we deal a lot, is or all our capital's invested in listed markets. There's been a huge amount of volatility, and also valuations have come down. And for those in the, private assets, it's still volatile, but you don't have that day-to-day stress of at least seeing your share price movement. But not to say that it's still not stressful, because as you alluded to, the amount of money circulating in private equities perhaps and ventures a lot less, and so there's going to be less of it to go around. How are you finding the space now? Do you see this current environment as a massive opportunity for people with the ability to deploy capital? Are you hunkering down with the businesses that you're invested in, or how are you looking at, let's skip 2022, it's been tough, let's go to 2023, and how are you sort of visualizing what that's going to look like?
I think there's really tremendous opportunity, because I think what's happened is there's been a little bit of a correction and a little bit of a back to reality. It wasn't so long ago, even in our space in consumer, you might have someone showing up with a PowerPoint presentation with no product and, wanting a $10 million, pre-revenue valuation and actually be able to command some of those things just because the market was very, very frothy. So I think you're seeing, much more of a return to reality. I think you're also seeing, founders being more realistic and being just more judicious with the capital that they had. Again, speaking a little bit to our own space in consumer retail. In the old days, the 1.0 version of the space, there was a real arbitrage through digital. You could basically spend money and acquire customers at pretty reasonable costs, and then you could go on to recover that, and VCs were willing to keep writing those checks through various rounds. I think now people have got a lot smarter about ways in which customers could be acquired organically and a lot cheaper. So you have those two forces coming together that, businesses are starting to be more right-sized. And I think, for the companies that are set up with really good products that can ride out the next 6 to 12 months, there'll be real opportunity there. And I think, going back to Stefan talking about buying his groceries online, if many bad things came out of COVID, but from a consumer investor point of view, one great thing that came out of COVID is just people got so facile with the internet and so willing to, buy stuff online, and also a lot of the trends around health and wellness, around sort of cooking at home, spending time with, they all speak to real tailwinds for a lot of key consumer categories. So all of that in a nutshell has been good. If it can be, people buttoning down the hatches and riding out for 6 months, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity going forward.
Do you raise external capital, or is it all internal capital between you and your founder?
So we have contributed capital ourselves, but we've also raised external capital from different places around the world. So without getting into too much of the detail, but we do have investors, I think, from about 12 or 13 different countries, including Australia and New Zealand. So it's a fair amount of external capital, and then my co-founder and I also contributed capital to kick things off.
Where do you sort of, when you're thinking about looking forward now, and given there's a lot of opportunity seems to be flowing out in the tech spaces, valuations become a little bit more depressed, and yes, it might not be as immediate in say the VC world or in pre-IPO entities, but what are the areas that are exciting you at the moment?
So I think in the consumer space, very excited about companies and categories where there's sort of real fundamental differentiation around the product. And so if you think about, some of the early companies we talked about, like a Dollar Shave, that James mentioned, or a Warby, I mean, all of those companies effectively use contract manufacturing to take pre-existing stuff. Maybe it's as good as what the incumbent stuff was, maybe slightly better, and then just sell it through the internet, and people like that. I think now what you're seeing is people want real innovation, like this actual IP in this, mushroom-based burger that I'm eating. It's a special mushroom, and it's got some kind of, fungus to it that can only be found in some dark corner of Australia, and it's got all of these nootropic properties. Or, I'm wearing a sweater that's made out of some sort of very special, totally biodegradable material that's got IP and patent protection and everything around it. So I think in our space, we're starting to see companies that are really having true differentiation through both the IP as well as just the brand play, which was the first generation. And that's the kind of stuff that consumers are really starting to seek out now, whether it's in sunscreen that you put on your body, whether it's food that you ingest, whether it's the footwear that you have. Because at the end of the day, your basic consumption decisions as an individual, collectively have a pretty profound impact on what happens in the world. And I think that's just such a macro trend that young people think about, whether it's climate, whether it's environment, all of those things. And it's starting to seep into the decisions that they make, and that, companies are responding to that with innovative stuff.
It's an interesting thought, just the idea that, voting with your money rather than, I was just thinking of the context of recent local body elections in New Zealand, where engagement was left a lot to be desired. But on the other hand, you have this massive trend, as you say, where people are using their purchasing activity as a declaration of what's important to them, more so than ever before. And I guess the internet provides all this information and ability to look through and decide on what candidates or products it is that you're going to vote on.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing that's happened. I was going to say another interesting thing that's happening since he's not too far down the road. Old LeBron James here in LA, is that a lot of people that sort of have audiences and have passion around things are now getting into consumer products. It's sort of a natural thing for them to do to expand their careers and maybe things they're passionate about. So, Courtney Cox has an organic, biodegradable, better for you line of stuff for cleaning your house. It's called Home Court. Or Scarlett Johansson just launched, a line of skincare called Outset. And, one of, Noah Schnapp from Stranger Things, TV show that all the kids like on Netflix, he's launched a line of, first product is basically a vegan version of Nutella that's got more protein in it, it tastes better, and then you don't have this horrible environmental issue around palm oil. So that's, I know it's a slightly different segue, but you're seeing people with real megaphones who are getting into stuff that's fundamentally really good, and then that's resonating with their audiences and having quite a profound effect in certain categories.
So it's a form of, I guess in a way, it's impact investing really, isn't it? What you're doing is you're looking for not necessarily environmental outcomes, but product outcomes that drive a market. Yeah,
it's certainly a filter. I mean, we look for stuff, we're not, I'd say, impact investors per se as a label, but we do look for things that have a sort of better for you, better for the planet, just sort of top filter. And, we can certainly help some of our companies through partnerships, make them, for example, plastic neutral if they're in the personal care space and so on. So, yeah, we're returns driven, but that's a natural filter that we apply at the top.
The fascinating one that I've been looking at over the last, I guess, maybe it was catalyzed by COVID. It's not necessarily impact investing to the good, or probably depending on who's talking about it, but some of these massively valuable brands around alcohol, so Dwayne Johnson and Ryan Reynolds putting their name on a gin bottle and creating $1 billion company because, gin costs nothing to manufacture, yet they put their name on it. And it's, George Clooney, I think, has done a tequila or something like that. It's just incredible that they can use their, I guess, social media presence to create huge amounts of value for a product that's been around forever and tastes no different to anybody else's. But that digital branding and that megaphone, I don't think they're staying on their megaphone talking about how good tequila is for you, but in a way they kind of are.
I remember, didn't Shaq from my youth start a water company? I think that went for about
I
15
think
or something.
he might have. We're not investors in this, but a company I always find really amusing that I think maybe LeBron James or some other well-known people are in. You guys come across Liquid Death? It's effectively water in a can. I'm not even kidding you. They could be filling it out of the tap, but I think the latest valuation is about $700 or $800 million in a few years. And the whole idea is, you're a kid that's at some concert and you want to look cool at 660. So what you do basically is you drink Liquid Death that comes in this sort of, really sort of powerful looking can, but it's literally just water. So lots of interesting things going on.
The scary thing about the investment space is when you talk about a company that makes a can of water called Dr. Death and it's valued at 800 million, and that's US, so that's sort of 1.5 billion, let's say, Kiwi. I mean, that would be in the top 20 market cap of companies listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. I mean, it just really shows. I don't know what's more, surprising. One, that a company that's selling water in a can be worth that much, or the fact that New Zealand is so small and the world is a big place out there, and yet, and so sometimes we are punching above our weight when you think of,
look, 100. Yeah, no, 100%, James. And I think that's really for Kiwi entrepreneurs and also, frankly, for people who are investing in the companies. The scale of the opportunity in a place like the United States is really unbelievable. And again, to take a local example, if you think about, if I go to the local Whole Foods here, I'm going to find Fix and Fog. In fact, I had a couple of Aussie friends staying with me about a month ago, and they're big into Fix and Fog. They're basketball players and athletes. And so we went to Whole Foods in Santa Monica, and we bought some Fix and Fog product. And you think about just how much that business could do in a place like the United States if you have all-door distribution in thousands and thousands of shops, plus you're on Amazon, plus you've got your own e-commerce. And I think that's what's actually really exciting, is that you can solve a problem that might be quite a small problem around cleaning your teeth or what you put on your toast, but you can amplify that in a market like the US, and you can build a great business, maybe $500 million to $1 billion, if you do it well in a fairly, reasonable amount of time as well.
Does it still not surprise you, but make you? I mean, what you do is in your career, it's what I find really fascinating is, as someone I have no creativity, so I'm not ever going to suggest that I could have come up with these ideas, but sitting there thinking, I'm going to disrupt the peanut butter market, which is really saturated. There's lots of it there. Everybody knows what it tastes like. Or the nappy market, what Zuru did with their nappy brand. I mean, everybody knows what nappies are. Surely there's no way you can disrupt the nappy consumption market other than make it a bit more, I guess, environmental, but yet the people are taking pretty benign products or things that we consume and making them cool and growing huge market share.
100%, and I think what that really reinforces to me, James, even going back to the academic days, is all the levers that you have around sort of marketing to build a great company. So, let's take as table stakes that you have a pretty good product, but if you go after the right target customer with the right branding message, with sort of appropriate pricing strategy, and you layer in some interesting angle of specialty distribution, ways of reaching customers, and you put all that together, even though, okay, it's just another nappy, but somehow actually in the minds of the customers, it's really quite different. And again, not to oversell the fluff end of things, but just to sort of make a point, there was a classic study that I think we could appreciate in New Zealand. A friend of mine did it years ago in London, where they're looking at the effect of branding on people's perception of beer. So you get a bunch of people in the pub, and basically you give them 8 glasses of beer or 6 glasses of beer, whatever it was. And what it is, every bit of it is Foster's. and then so they're all drinking Fosters. They don't realise this, but actually, when they taste it, they actually think it's very, very different when you then give them the name of the brand. So you're giving them all Fosters, but you're telling them, one's Bud Light, one's Coors, whatever. And then they create sort of a map, which people do in market research, a perceptual map. And instead of all the stuff just being all clumped together, it's all over the place, because when you think you're drinking Bud Light versus Coors, you've got this, I'm thinking about St. Louis and Coors and Bud Light, the horses and the, Super Bowl ad. And somehow it creates this massive perceptual separation, even though in the experiment, people were literally drinking the same thing, which I think was Foster's at the time. So, not to oversell what I would say the soft end of things, but it just shows you that the power of differentiation through branding and all of the bonding stuff we talked about. And if you layer that into a product that's truly a great product, like a, Rascal and Friends diaper, or like Etique, or like Fix and Fog, then you can have a real winner on your hands.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about it from a business and academic point of view, like we are now, you think, how can it happen? And then I go to the supermarket and buy a $7 bottle of milk from Lewis Road, which is no different from the $3 one. It came from probably the same cow on the same production line. Yet you do, because there's value there. But it's I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's human nature, and decision making is fascinating.
David, what would you say to Kiwi entrepreneurs who are listening on the call who, are thinking about their next stage? Are there any sort of bits of advice you would give them in your journey so far? Particularly thinking about, how do I go to market and go to America?
So the first thing I would say is, definitely that should be on your radar. I mean, America is just the consumption engine in some sense. Of course, there are other markets in Asia very big as well, Europe collectively, but America is just such a big consumption engine. And as we were talking before the show, it's very accessible now. You can come to New York, LA, you've got all these jumping off points. New Zealand kind of has this halo of North America. So number one, it should be on your radar to do it. But number two is more the caveat is, superficially, the two countries are similar in the ways that we talked about earlier. We all speak English, we consume similar cultural products and everything else, but the markets here are very nuanced and very different. So, you really do need to make sure that if you're coming in here, that you're doing the fundamental research, you're teaming up with people who have understanding of the market and what's the right way to roll it out. It's just a massive place. Do you start in Houston? Do you start in LA? Do you launch in New York City? Should you start in the interior of the country? So all that element of execution, I think, is very nuanced and something that's really hard to understand just from a pure base in New Zealand. But, selfishly as an investor and someone from New Zealand, there's nothing more than I would like to see New Zealand companies take that path and succeed, because I think it has an outsized impact really for two reasons. Number one is, as we've discussed, consumer entrepreneurship is super accessible. You've got a great idea, you understand a pain point very well. All the enabling factors there are in place to help you deliver that product and take it to market. And then number two, there's a multitude of ways that those companies can scale and then be successful in terms of an exit and an outcome for the founder as well. So that would be my advice to aspiring entrepreneurs is 100% have it on the radar, but just understand that in doing it, there's going to be some nuance and complexity that's hard to understand from New Zealand until you really come up here and sort of get your hands dirty a bit.
Fantastic. David, look, it's been wonderful speaking with you, a really varied and interesting conversation, and you've obviously involved in a wide range of great and cool activities. So, thank you for your time, and we wish you all the best for the next phase, and for I guess the originating some really cool investment opportunities as you go.
100%. Well, look, thanks, Stefan. Thanks to you too, James. And, as we talk online and offline, it's really nice to engage digitally, but hopefully we'll all catch up in New Zealand at some point, or up here in person. So thanks for the discussion. I really, really enjoyed it.
Great. We can have a Foster's together.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. Yeah, you took my line.
Or maybe
Charts.
Liquid Death or something, perhaps.
Liquid Death, 100%.
All right.